Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to another episode of SIT. Today we have Mr. Thomas Countryman. Mr. Thomas Countryman serves as the chairman of the board for the Arms Control Association. Mr. Countryman brings a record 35 years of foreign service experience in the United States, where he retired as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. A very warm welcome, Mr. Thomas Countryman, today.
Thank you, Sid, for inviting me.
Mm-hmm. So as we speak, there have been many developments. The first question that I'm going to ask you is, have you watched the movie Oppenheimer?
I did. I watched it on its opening day in Washington and found it to be a brilliant piece of filmmaking with a very important message. And I note the many criticisms that it left out important pieces of history. And we could discuss those, but I think the most important thing about it is that I would hope it would remind your generation what my generation was very conscious of in the 60s and the 70s, and that is the real risk of a nuclear war that could end human civilization. That risk was created in 1945, and it has never gone away.
Exactly, very true, because I have heard you speak previously and you have highlighted two very interesting things. There are two good news in the current threat level of nuclear risk. The good news is that there is two news actually. So the good news is today's nuclear risk is less, and the bad news is that the risk is not zero. This is something you have advocated for in many of your conversations and speeches previously. Could you just describe about this one particular phase that we are in compared to the Cold War reference that you have also given, that the last time nuclear risk was so high was during the Cold War period?
Yes, I think the last time the risk was this high was 1962 in what the Americans call the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Russians call the Caribbean Crisis, when decisions made well below the presidential level could have led to a nuclear exchange between Russia and the United States. And recall that was at a time when the two countries had less capability to deliver nuclear warheads against each other than they do today. But still, that was a very scary situation. The sunshine behind that dark cloud was that it led to an intensive series of negotiations between Moscow and Washington that resulted in a number of agreements and understandings that greatly reduced the risk of nuclear war. We are back at a high point in terms of nuclear risk because, first, some of those agreements are no longer valid and others are no longer being respected from the Russian side. And second, the mere fact that the constant international tension between the US and Russia that we've seen for 75 years is no longer differentiated from the need to treat nuclear risk as a separate category, to categorize one issue, nuclear risk, as an issue we have to keep working on no matter how bad things are in the rest of our political relationship. So this is the primary, but not the only factor that makes me concerned that the risk is the highest that we've seen in the last 60 years.
Indeed, and this kind of risk also dictates many moves in the future, especially concerning arms control actions and non-proliferation regime. One thing that we are going to touch upon in our conversation today. But I remember this one particular scene in the movie where Robert Oppenheimer was constantly pushing for setting an international framework for arms control to perhaps control the proliferation, the spread of nuclear weapons to every other country. And as a response to that, we could see he was put in a kangaroo court, and he was purged from his position, and his security clearance was taken away from him. So, what is the history of arms control proliferation regime? What is the history of building a consensus by the international community on arms control?
Yeah. There were certainly many reasons why Oppenheimer ultimately fell out of favor with the nuclear establishment, simply arguing for restraint when the American military and political establishment believed that nuclear weapons gave the US incredible power. That was enough to make enemies. But specifically, the idea of international control of nuclear weapons was something that was too difficult for either Americans or Soviets to accept at that time. The concept of non-proliferation agreements, of preventing a situation in which every country possessed nuclear weapons, was more popular, and it resulted in the most important treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that went into effect in 1970. That was much less controversial than the idea that an international body could control America's nuclear weapons. The history of non-proliferation and arms control is both a multilateral history involving all countries of the world and a bilateral history between Washington and Moscow. And progress on one track has always encouraged progress on the other track at the same time. Conversely, when we have very little progress on either track, it contributes to a sense that both arms control and non-proliferation are at a crisis point today.
Well, thank you, sir, for drawing that out for us. Coming back to Russia, I was there in the room when Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, announced in the national press hall, talking about his willingness to negotiate with Russians about New START treaty, about nuclear weapons and arms control, without any preconditions. So this happened during the Arms Control Association annual conference. And have we seen any developments on this? Because I remember there were welcoming noises from the Kremlin about Jake Sullivan's statement. So what is the present environment? What is the present development in Washington today on this?
That's a very good question. I had the honor to introduce Mr. Sullivan for that important speech to our organization, the Arms Control Association. And it was something that very much needed to be said, that he pointed out that the risk of nuclear conflict because of miscommunication or other tensions remained high, and that we had to address that issue. And also that we had to address how to prevent an arms race among the US, Russia, and China after the New START treaty expires in 2026. And I absolutely agree, from outside of government, these are the two urgent tasks for the US and Russia to address together. So I was very encouraged that he spoke with the right urgency, and that he said, we are ready to talk without preconditions. That is, regardless of how much we disagree about Russia's war in Ukraine. The response from Moscow was a little bit mixed. There were some negative words, there were some positive words. As far as I can tell, it has not moved forward since then. If the United States government has now made a good proposal to the Russians about how to get started, I'm not aware of it. I know bureaucracy can be very slow, even writing a 2-page piece of paper to give to the Russians to say, here's how to start. But I think it's an exceptionally slow bureaucracy. And I don't think that we have seen the urgency from either government that Mr. Sullivan communicated so effectively that day. without question, there are things we can talk about, and we can talk about it even as we disagree so strongly about Ukraine. The important thing is to begin the dialogue and to begin it without either side seeking to gain political advantage by saying, we're ready to talk and you're not, your agenda is wrong, ours is correct. The temptation right now in both capitals is to use every small difference as a public relations vehicle as well. And I hope that both governments can overcome that, and very quietly, without the world listening in to every meeting, begin to discuss what steps we can take to reduce this risk.
I mean, right, there is no progress, and this is absolutely very alarming because the New START treaty itself is a very important piece of work, and I have spoken to people who have worked in ratifying and verifying the treaty through the Senate and Congress. So yes, what kind of implications does it have for United States right now if Russia has decided to suspend its participation from New START agreement?
The immediate consequences are not huge.
Mm-hmm.
What Russia has suspended is the very detailed monitoring and verification provisions of the treaty. It is really extraordinary when you think about it, that two nations with this 60, 75-year-long hostility to each other share so much information about the most sensitive topic, which is the location of their nuclear weapons. But in the more than 12 years that New START has been in force, they have exchanged with each other more than 20,000 notifications every time they move a nuclear weapon from one location to another. Now, we have a very good idea of how many missiles, bombers, and warheads the Russians have. They have a very good idea about us. We have other national technical means, that is surveillance satellites, to keep track of where nuclear weapons are. But gradually, over time, the confidence you have about what the other side is holding begins to erode because of the failure to do these notifications. So it's a violation by the Russian side that has no legal basis. There's nothing in the treaty that says you can stop doing this part of the treaty. The important point is that Russia has said that they intend to continue to abide by the central limits. And that's the most important part of the treaty, is that each side is limited to 1,550 strategic warheads. And Russia realizes the value in not leaving the treaty entirely and building up beyond that limit, because the United States could build up just as rapidly, probably more rapidly, to the advantage of neither side.
Right. It's very interesting how you pointed out that every time they move any nuclear warhead, according to New START agreement, United States gets a notification on that kind of movement.
Yeah.
And in light of
not in the last 6 months, but
exactly, yeah. But there has been a very interesting development there as well, because President Putin's continuous implicit nuclear saber rattling was also backed by a very unprecedented move where he placed nuclear warheads in Belarus, a country which is a client state of Russia. So what exactly is President Putin trying to do? I don't think we can answer that question, but we can definitely make some speculations about it. What do you think, sir?
Certainly, I'll give you my thoughts on it.
Yeah.
It starts from the fact that Russia is no longer a superpower in most senses of the word. It is losing population. It is an economy that is resource extractive and not innovative. It does not have the same political influence it once had. Its conventional army has been shown to be inferior to the Ukrainian army. And so the only dimension in which Russia can still claim to be a superpower is possession of nuclear weapons. Now, that's the assets they have. The challenge they have, Russia used to have, like most countries, a multidimensional foreign policy in which they had many interests in the world. Today, they have just one foreign policy priority, and that is success in Ukraine, even if they have to constantly change the definition of success.
And we are
So
seeing how it's unfolding.
if you have only one issue you care about, and you have only one resource that gives you credibility, you're going to use that resource to address your one priority. And that is what Mr. Putin has done with nuclear weapons since the very beginning of the all-out invasion last year. And when I say use nuclear weapons, many people understand use nuclear weapons to mean you have detonated a nuclear weapon against your enemy. But that's not the only way that nuclear weapons are used. If a man goes into a store with a gun and steals money from the store, but does not ever fire his gun, he has used the gun in commission of a crime. In the same way, the Soviet Union and the United States have used nuclear weapons in the past. That is, to threaten very explicitly or very subtly potential enemies with the detonation of nuclear weapons, or just the reminder that we are a nuclear power and you are not. I would note that that kind of threat almost never works. It didn't help the US in Vietnam. It didn't help the Russians in Afghanistan. But Mr. Putin has followed, it seems, a script of constantly reminding and slowly escalating the potential threat, from saying, don't forget, we can respond with unimaginable force, to putting his forces on alert, to talking about the suspension of the provisions of the New START Treaty, moving weapons to Belarus, hinting that the Russians may resume nuclear testing after not having tested for more than 30 years. And all of these are steps that are intended to do one big thing, which is to make Europeans nervous and therefore reduce their support for Ukraine. This is the way he's using nuclear weapons. I think he understands well that actually detonating a nuclear weapon on the Ukrainian battlefield would do much more harm than good to the Russian position. So if he's rational, he won't do that. But I think he will continue to try to raise the fear of that in the West. It would be such a crazy thing to do and would cost Russia its friendship with China that I don't think he will do it. But you never know. Nobody knows what is inside the very isolated head of Vladimir Putin.
Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned China, the limitless friendship they have with the Russians. We're going to come back to that as well. But here I'm going to pick up on something that you mentioned, the types of threat and how Russia is using the threat of nuclear weapons to create deterrence to keep the West away. However, we have seen how counterproductive it turned out to be because of the combined collective mutual efforts of the entire European Union combined with NATO forces to help and support Ukraine in this war effort. So instead of, and of course, the expansion of NATO as well, with Finland in and Sweden almost inside, as Turkey has been now appeased. So this has been a very disastrous foreign policy calculation from the Kremlin.
From the very beginning, it
Yes.
has been a travesty for Mr. Putin in saying that NATO was a threat to Russia He's only succeeded in making NATO stronger and more unified. In trying to threaten the Ukrainian people with subjugation and slavery. He has only unified the Ukrainian people to resist. Nuclear weapons are very effective at what they are designed for, which is the annihilation of an enemy. They are very ineffective when someone tries to use them as an element of persuasion.
Right. Absolutely. And there's also a new type of threat that we have not seen during conventional wars, which is now emerging right now in Ukraine, the threat of nuclear accident in Zaporizhia power plant. Yeah. Over the course of the battle, we have seen constant shelling and conventional attack on Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Rafael Grossi, the Director General of IAEA, the nuclear watchdog of United Nations, has continuously raised the alarm, offered his assessment and his conclusion of his multiple visits to Zaporizhia, saying that this issue is very alarming and we are at the brink of a nuclear disaster. Previously, we have seen how it unfolded in Fukushima, in Chernobyl. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So what is the current situation of Zaporizhia in terms of a nuclear accident right now?
Yeah, well, first to put the situation in context, in terms of Russia's imperial land grab, which is a recipe the Russians have been following for several hundred years, they're very interested in the most valuable economic assets. And the largest nuclear power station in Europe is certainly one of the valuable assets that the Russians would like to keep. So they don't have an incentive in destroying it. They do have an incentive in preventing Ukraine from regaining control of the power plant. And as a consequence, both sides take dangerous risks that can affect the safety of the power plant. It is very hard to know how big the risk is at the moment. There are conflicting reports about how strongly Russia has fortified the area. The Ukrainians claim they have placed mines and bombs around the plant. The fact that the plant is not operating at full speed is a loss for Russia. But it also means that a single stray artillery shell is very unlikely to cause the kind of major radiation release that you saw at Chernobyl or Fukushima. I always worry, and again, it's a question of whether or not you believe in the rationality of Mr. Putin. I think back to one of a very similar leader, Saddam Hussein, who, when forced to retreat from Kuwait, detonated all of the oil wells of Kuwait in a singular act of spite.
I remember the visuals from that oil wells while the F-16s were flying overhead, right?
And I don't discount the possibility that the Russians would do something similar, just as they have been systematically destroying all of the economic assets of Ukraine that they can reach.
That is definitely very alarming. And I would like to circle back to China, because you mentioned that any sort of nuclear escalation from Russia will definitely cost a friendship that it has presently with Xi Jinping. Now, China has sort of President Xi Jinping has directly made it clear to President Putin that any sort of nuclear escalation will be condemned by China. And China, being itself a signatory to NFU No First Use, it has a strict no nuclear policy and advocates for the same for other countries as well. And however, very recently the Pentagon concluded that China is currently engaged in a nuclear buildup, significantly increasing its nuclear stockpile, forecasting 1,500 warheads by 2035, which is a 428% increment from 400 to 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. This is definitely an alarming development. This finding by the American intelligence community is very important, I believe. So, what are the immediate implications for global nuclear security when we talk about China?
Well, let me go back first to the relationship between Russia and China. I don't know if Mr. Xi has said directly to Mr. Putin, do not use nuclear weapons as you are threatening. I have more confidence in the judgment and the rationality of Mr. Xi than I do in Mr. Putin. And so I hope he has said so, and that would certainly be the smart position for China to take. But whether he's actually made that explicit, I don't know. The US intelligence community does estimate that China will expand its current warhead total, which is around 300, into the area of 1,500 in the next 10 to 12 years. And certainly China is capable of doing that. They are operating the breeder plutonium, the breeder reactors that will create the plutonium for such weapons. And they are also building the infrastructure of delivery vehicles in terms of missile silos, bombers, and submarines that could deliver a larger number of nuclear warheads. It is a serious departure for China from its long-stated policy of having what they call nuclear sufficiency, which is enough warheads to guarantee that if they are attacked with nuclear warheads, they can respond sufficiently. It changes from a purely defensive deterrence posture to a war-fighting posture in which there are increased opportunities and increased thought given to using nuclear warheads in a conventional conflict rather than reserving them only as your second strike deterrent. So it has big implications for China's policy. It is, in my view, absolutely inconsistent with the obligation that China has, like the US and Russia, to make a good faith effort to reduce arsenals. China refuses to be in bilateral discussions with the United States about this, and is the only one of the 5 recognized nuclear powers that is rapidly increasing its arsenal. So I do hope that we can avoid a two-way or a three-way arms race among US, Russia, and China. But that depends a lot upon wise leadership in all 3 capitals.
Right, definitely to watch there in coming days and years to come. So another threat that the world currently faces, or United States maintains a very high level assessment of, is Iran. Iran, at any point of history today, is closest to develop a nuclear weapon program, closest to develop nuclear weapons right now. Highly enriched uranium capacity, they have constantly talked about and shown about. There have been some conversations in the DC strategic community that there are efforts being made to revive the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which prohibits Iran from developing, enriching nuclear beyond civilian use, while United States lifts any sort of sanction, economic sanctions, and provides all sort of economic relief to Iran. Now that deal is dead. So what is the current threat assessment that you personally have of Iran? And what is the conversation in the DC strategic community that you are a part of when it comes to Iran?
Mm-hmm. The DC community has many conversations. They are often among people like me who have no authority,
Definitely. But I'm more interested to know, like, the likes of you who have served and seen
Okay,
and experienced firsthand. I'm not talking
sure.
about the people who come on TV at 9 p.m. and discuss
Okay.
about Iran
Well,
and North
sometimes
Korea.
that's me. Um,
Exactly.
the So the first point to keep in mind is that today Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. It is closer than ever before to having enough highly enriched uranium to make one nuclear weapon. But beyond that step, you have to design a weapon. Presumably, you have to test it. So they are several steps away from possessing a nuclear capability that can threaten its neighbors. And it's fairly clear that Iran goes back and forth on the desirability of actually building a nuclear weapon, but it has a certain amount of consensus on the idea that getting closer and closer to build a nuclear weapon is a good way to extract concessions from the United States and other countries. So they'll continue on that path, particularly when at the moment there is no opening for negotiations.
Another way, how you said, using nuclear weapons without detonating them.
Yeah, except they don't have
They
the
don't
weapon.
have nuclear weapon, but the energy, the
They
idea of
use the
nuclear.
concept of nuclear
Yes,
weapons
exactly.
to influence other people's conceptual reality. The it is unfortunate that there have been no meaningful negotiations in Vienna on reviving the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action for more than a year now. It is important that there be some contacts between Iran and the United States. No matter how much distrust there is, it's important we find a way to talk to each other. So the encouraging signal in the last few weeks has been this agreement to unfreeze some of the money that the US confiscated from Iran and allow Iran to spend it on humanitarian needs. And in return for some dual citizens, American Iranian citizens, to be released back to the US. These are hostages who should never have been imprisoned. It is far from an answer to the nuclear question, but I think it's a necessary step to demonstrate to people in both capitals that it is possible to make agreements with people you don't trust. I don't know if and when we'll get back to a meaningful bilateral negotiation, but the big problems start by solving smaller problems. So I have a tiny bit of optimism today.
Great. I like how you described that, how we should talk to people whom we don't like. And another set of people whom we don't really trust are North Koreans. So there has been some a lot of movement in DC lately when it comes to North Korea. Uh, South Korean president was sort of signaling about having a domestic nuclear weapons program. Then he comes on a state visit to Washington, and he is offered the nuclear security umbrella by President Biden. And then right now there is a trilateral relationship between Japan, South Korea, and United States in countering threats collectively. So can you talk about this trilateral engagement in the Korean Peninsula?
Sure. It is a fact that North Korea not only has nuclear weapons and delivery vehicles, but it talks all the time about its readiness to strike South Korea or Japan or the United States. And so it's understandable that in South Korea, there's a considerable part of the population and among thinkers in South Korea that they should have an equivalent capacity. And that's been true for a long time. You don't have the same phenomenon in Japan because the memory of Japan being the first victim of nuclear weapons is too strong there. But in South Korea, there is this tendency, and it's something I've been discussing with South Koreans and Japanese for many years. It is a bad idea for South Korea to build its own nuclear weapons. It will not be the case that the world will say North Korean nuclear weapons bad, but South Korean nuclear weapons good. That's not how it works once you have signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they underestimate how strong the reaction of the world would be, including from the United States. And they greatly underestimate the utility of nuclear weapons in any confrontation with North Korea. So I think President Biden did the right thing in the Washington Declaration released a few months ago that states very clearly our commitment to the defense of the Republic of Korea, including, if necessary, a nuclear deterrent. What I'm not so pleased with is that immediately afterwards, the South Korean government and the press stress not at the end, including, if necessary, a nuclear deterrent, but they put that right up front. The message that the US seeks to convince both Tokyo and Seoul is that the primary deterrent is conventional unified alliance. And the nuclear deterrent is there only if necessary. To emphasize the nuclear first can cause all three nations to lose focus on the need to have a strong alliance among the three and a strong conventional deterrence among the three. And I hope that the recent Camp David summit of the three leaders will reinforce that point. Yes, in extremis, we are a nuclear alliance, but the day-to-day work that has to be done is improving our coordination and improving our conventional deterrent capacity.
Indeed, right. And another region that I am particularly very interested in is South and Central Asia. I remember last time when we were sitting together, you told me about this incident of 2019 between India and Pakistan, two arch enemies who have fought three major wars and multiple protracted wars, continue to have so in the present as we speak. So while I am an observer of the region, you pointed out to me that in 2019, when there was a aerial war dogfight going on between both countries, the situation in Washington was very different. You have never seen two nuclear armed countries fighting like that before, in almost like and at the brink of a conventional war. So what was the feeling then? How close we were to spark any sort of nuclear breakdown there, or any sort of conversation about nuclear wars, nuclear warheads to be put in the battlefield? Because someone who comes from India, I have never thought about that myself. So I would really be interested to know, our viewers would be interested to know what role does nuclear weapons could possibly play in a likely scenario of an India and Pakistan fallout.
Yes. I like the point you make there. If you live in India or Pakistan, you don't really want to imagine nuclear war in your own country, but you don't mind talking about nuclear war between the US and Russia. And US and Russians, Americans and Russians feel the same way. We don't want to think that it could happen to us, but we're happy to talk about the risk of a India-Pakistan nuclear war.
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
I can't say how close that conflict was to becoming a nuclear war. The decision to use nuclear weapons in both countries is complex. It's not simply a single prime minister who can decide that, legally and in practice. And that's true of both countries. But what did concern me very much was the language that was being used by some political and military leadership on both sides, and by the press and especially the social media in both sides. That's what bothered me quite a bit, because first, they are two nations that have very strong feelings of nationalism, particularly when it is concerns their neighbor. And that feeling of nationalism and of the threat that we are a nuclear power and we've got to remind that other country that we are a nuclear power. If there were politicians who were more susceptible to that kind of public opinion, we could have easily had nuclear first use there by one side or the other. So I was very worried. I don't think we can know until we read the memoirs of various prime ministers and generals just how close we came. But it was a very scary precedent.
Right. And it's definitely true. The command and control and the entire doctrine of nuclear weapons in both countries are very different. While there is a more decentralized approach in India, there is a highly centralized military control over the nuclear warheads in Pakistan, which is again concerning.
Yeah. Well, overly centralized and overly decentralized nuclear command are both dangerous.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
I wonder if you could allow me to share the screen, because there's...
Oh, yes, please. Yeah, we'll be more than happy to have you share the screen. Yeah.
I just want to show one picture, which when I talk to American audiences, I think people are very much unaware of what a nuclear weapon is. Mm-hmm. We've seen bombs exploding in Ukraine, in Syria, in Afghanistan, and we think, yeah, bombing, that's pretty tough. And I guess a nuclear weapon is bigger. But in fact, it is so many times bigger that you have no idea. So I'm putting up this little shot. This is from a website I recommend called outrider.org. That has a lot of valuable information about climate change.
I think this is the one which sort of simulates the impact of nuclear detonation in a map or something like that.
And this is a map of Bangalore.
Okay, a city where I spent 5 glorious years of my life.
That's why I chose it. But at this website, you can pick any location of your friends or your enemies. This shows the detonation of a 300 kiloton warhead. And that is the standard size for Russian and American warheads. And we have more than 1,000 warheads of this size aimed at each other. I don't know the exact size of the Indian or Pakistani arsenal in terms of their yield. Probably most of their nuclear weapons are much less than 300 kilotons. But just to give you an example of a 1 square meter fireball and 725,000 fatalities if dropped in the middle of the city of Bangalore. This is not an ordinary bomb. This is not a slightly bigger bomb. So I encourage people to keep that in mind, especially those who are quick to say, oh, we'll just use a little nuclear weapon here or there. I agree very strongly with the former Secretary of State, George Shultz, who said there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Once you have crossed the line into nuclear weapons detonation, you are in the strategic field, and you're talking about strategic weapons.
This is very interesting, the way you have highlighted and shown us right now the mere potential regular nuclear warhead can cause to any big city in the world, including Bangalore, as you just showed. And certainly people discount the threat and the dangers of nuclear weapons when they start talking about initiating any sort of detonation of any, initiating the whole conversation at the first place. So yes, coming back to a good news, like coming forward to a good news, now that we have had such serious discussions about nuclear weapons, and you almost showed me what it looks like bombing a major Indian city. So I would like our audience to come to some good news now.
Okay.
So just recently, I heard from your successor, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, who is now the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security. Her department was very closely working and monitoring the destruction of the last stockpile of chemical weapons of the United States. Now, this is a very interesting development, because we have seen in the past how much of a disaster chemical weapons can cause. We saw that in Syria, we saw that during the Gulf War, Iraq-Iran war, and we continue to speculate about its effects even today. So how big of an achievement is it? Does the world still face any risks from chemical or biological weapons?
I think it's a very big achievement. It's very important. I'll come at it, though, from a different angle, which is the U.S. signed the Chemical Weapons Convention and ratified it more than 20 years ago. And the convention said you have, I think it was 7 years, every country that signs, to destroy any chemical weapons they have. The United States had such a crazy amount of chemical weapons, ridiculously large number of tens of thousands of chemical weapons, that to destroy them safely took many more than 7 years, only completed this year, but completed safely, which is the key thing. There's always a shortcut, but that's not always safe. So that's a terrific achievement. On the one hand, I still worry very much about chemical weapons. There are countries that are suspected of continuing to have them. Certainly Syria continues to use chemical weapons, whether sophisticated nerve gas or ordinary chlorine, against its own citizens. Russia continues, and North Korea continue to use advanced fourth-generation chemical weapons against political opponents. So the problem has not gone away. But the Chemical Weapons Convention has been very largely successful in its goals, and it is a good news example of international cooperation and international determination. I do worry about chemical weapons. I do worry about biological weapons. But in my opinion, neither one of them poses the same threat to humanity as nuclear weapons. And that's why I continue to focus on it.
True.
I wonder if I might have one more
Cool.
shot,
Yes, sir.
if I can find it very quickly, because it's just another example of good news.
I personally believe that by this particular action, United States has set a very strong precedent for other countries to follow suit and recognize this kind of achievement. Yep.
So here's one other graph that shows you good news in the long run.
So this is the peak of Cold War, I guess, 1990.
Yes, and
1986.
The United States reached a peak of about 30,000 nuclear weapons in the late 1960s. The Russians, the Soviet Union, reached a peak of about 40,000 nuclear warheads in the early 1980s. And since that time, which meant that at one point there were 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. Since that time, the US and Russia, through a process of bilateral negotiation, have each eliminated more than 85% of their arsenals. So that today, instead of 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, there are about 12,000, 12 to 13,000. And the US and Russia continue to reduce that number. We are both still dismantling warheads. It is, other countries have slightly increased. It is still the fact that the US and Russia together have more than 90% of the warheads in the world. But I prefer to draw the good news story from here, that diplomacy, negotiation, talking to people that you don't fully trust can result in a meaningful accomplishment for humanity. And I also draw the lesson that this process is not done. There's a lot more work to do to bring that ever closer to zero nuclear weapons.
Yes, sir. That's a great way to conclude our discussion. But now that we are at the concluding moment, I would like to ask this one concluding question. Now that we have discussed all sorts of threats and risks today in terms of nuclear proliferation, from Iran to North Korea to India, Pakistan, all the way back to Russia and China, what the future of arms control is looking today?
Yeah. Well, 2 points. One is we first have to get restarted in the process. And it's difficult at a moment when in all three capitals, Washington and Beijing, and especially Moscow, there is such hostility towards your negotiating partner. There is so much distrust, misinformation, and what we call chest thumping, desire to show that we are stronger than you. And I worry very much about this phenomenon in all three countries. It creates the political obstacle to even getting things started, as none of these national leaders want to look weak. I always try to make the point that discussing arms control and talking to an adversary is not a sign of weakness. It is a recognition that in the real world, one of the best ways to ensure your own nuclear security is to reduce the threat that someone else poses. And therefore, we are all better off if we can continue to reduce nuclear weapons. That's the political obstacle. There's also kind of an intellectual obstacle that's going to make this even tougher. For about 50 years, we knew how to talk between Washington and Moscow. We kind of understood each other. We developed a common terminology. And we kind of always knew what is the next challenge, the next thing we have to talk about. It's less simple today. First, because China intends to be a major player in a nuclear arms race, or, I prefer, in a nuclear negotiation. And a three-way negotiation is harder than two. Second, the next nuclear agreements have to be not just about the numbers, but about behavior and about commitments on not deploying nuclear weapons in certain circumstances, about communication channels, about not growing arsenals. There are new commitments that are harder to negotiate than just saying, let's each go from 2,000 down to 1,500. And that's a big intellectual challenge that I think we have to be ready for. I think good minds are working on it in Washington and Beijing and Moscow. But it's not going to be quite as simple as in the past. What gives me some confidence is that we've never had a president in the United States who knew as much about nuclear policy and who was so committed to arms control as Joe Biden. And I don't think he's going to lose that commitment. He's certainly constrained politically, and he's certainly constrained also by Russia's war in Ukraine. But I think he still has that commitment. And that's kind of the first ingredient you need is a commitment from one leader, and then you got to find leaders to reflect that.
Brilliant. And this sort of very optimistic take on the future of arms control couldn't be a better way to end our discussion. Mr. Countryman, thank you for such a candid and yet a very, very highly well-informed discussion. I'm sure our audience is going to take a lot from today's discussion, think about our future, and they are definitely going to learn a lot about the risks and hopes for the future that we have when it comes to nuclear weapons.
I hope it inspires some brilliant young minds, because we need some brilliant minds in the field in every country on Earth if we're going to continue to reduce nuclear risk.
Indeed. On that note, sir, thank you very much for your time today.
Sid. I enjoyed this. Very good questions.